Thank you for joining us here on Checking the Vitals. I am Todd Schlosser, and of course I am joined by our special guest, Eric Tesdahl, who is the Senior Biostatistician at SpecialtyCare. And I did a little stalking on your LinkedIn profile. I saw that you actually have a doctorate in philosophy from Vanderbilt.
That's right, yeah.
So around when did you graduate?
2013.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So you've been working sort of in the biostatistician realm since then, I'd imagine?
Yeah. It's kind of an interesting story. I'm trained as a social scientist, as a researcher. Yeah. And while I was doing that, while I was a student, you have to learn a lot of statistics to do that job.
I'd imagine.
A lot of statistical modeling. And I started to get contacted by people in the medical center at Vanderbilt to do consulting in biostatistics. So it's something that kind of evolved as a side business because of skills that I had as a researcher that really kind of took off when I finished my postdoc.
So when you started at SpecialtyCare, you started, I guess, as a senior biostatistician.
That's right.
And you now take these numbers that come in from the people in the field, our clinicians in the field, and sort of answer questions around the data that you're getting.
Absolutely.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about that. And you told me the story of sort of what a statistician does, sort of in general. You collect all this data from stories that come from, in our case, the clinicians.
Yeah.
You turn that. Well, you sort of analyze that data, and then you have to turn that analyzed data back into a story, and that comes out as like a research paper, and you sort of publish those.
Yeah.
So I'd like to talk about sort of that life cycle of what those research papers are and how they come to fruition, I should say. So how do you collect the initial stories?
The nice thing about working in a big organization that's as amazingly staffed as it is that I don't collect really the stories or the information. I'm, in a lot of sense, the thing you were mentioning about a statistician is I'm kind of a middleman, right? I've got a lot of tools for dealing with data, but that's kind of its own specific realm. And so when I want to do that, I look to people who actually know a phenomenon really well. And so here in SpecialtyCare, we have people who are kind of really the best, in perfusion or neuromonitoring or anything to do with surgical services, and they're the ones who know the questions, right? So they have done, their practice for decades. They know the important questions to ask. And the information comes from, all the people who are clinicians who are doing procedures every day. And so they're entering that into the SCOPE database. And over time, our clinical experts, an Al Stammers or a Tony Sestokis, they'll say, hey, there's a really important question, and I think we have enough data to answer it. And so, that's kind of the genesis of the question. And that's where I get involved. People want to say, how do we understand what's the best practice to use in this situation? How do we really help our patients to get to the other side of the surgery as safely as possible?
And that's all coming from the clinicians in the field in our case?
Yeah, the clinicians in the field or other discussions that are going on in journals or things that payers want to know about. There's a lot of parties that are involved, as you know.
Sure, yeah. So like if it's perfusion, it might be like an Al Stammers or Linda Mongero type figure in the, realm of perfusion that says, hey, we should focus on this.
Absolutely.
And then like a Tony Sestokis for IONM.
Exactly right. O'Brien Willett.
Oh yeah, absolutely. We've actually interviewed all of those people on Scrubbing In. Yeah.
So if you have a conversation with them and you ask them, they could probably list a half a dozen or more just pressing research questions that they have built up in their mind because they kind of see where the field's at and where they think it needs to go. And so I get involved with the tools and the knowledge that I have about what it takes to really answer some of those questions with data. So there are modeling techniques that we do. There are ways to take the data and visualize it and help us think more deeply about what we're seeing.
Sure.
And then at some point, this often morphs into a conference presentation. So if you talk about the life cycle,
to the conference?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So if you talk about the life cycle of one of these papers, it almost always starts out as a conference presentation. So there's an upcoming conference. There'll be a deadline. Please submit an abstract.
Right.
So that's just kind of a short summary of some research that you've done. So we'll start in on one of these questions, get some data.
Right.
I'll do some analysis. We'll have a bunch of back and forth conversations. I'll say, this is what it sort of looks like. Does this make sense? And we'll kind of interpret it together and pursue the analysis. Then we'll get to some good working draft of what we have and submit that.
Right.
And folks at the conference will review it. They're very knowledgeable in their clinical areas, and they'll say, oh, this is going to add value to our conference. We would like to invite you to come and make a full presentation.
Right.
And then at that point, we go back to what we started and really flesh everything out. Address all the what-if questions that come in. You deal with something like cardiac surgery. It's It's a really mature field.
Yeah.
A lot of people have been working into answering questions for a long time. So there are a lot of kind of intervening factors you need to account for if you want to answer one particular new question.
Right.
So you kind of have to account for all the old questions and then say, okay, here's my new question. And Scope is really an excellent tool for that because
Scope being the database where we collect all this information,
exactly.
sort of house all the information.
Exactly.
Right.
Thank you. Yeah. It's an excellent resource because we have a lot of patients that we help. So that means we have a lot of, observations. And as a statistician, it's really important you have big sample size.
Right.
So you can kind of be sure of what you're seeing. But we also collect a lot of individual pieces of information. And each of those helps us to say, accounting for X and Y and Z and the other thing, setting that all aside, we can then answer a new particular question.
Right.
Say it's not because of age or gender or how big a person was and their habitus or their body size. And so, so that's a really nice aspect of working for specialty care.
Sure, absolutely, because you have a lot of, the pool of data you have to, play in is much bigger, I'd imagine, because specialty care is the largest provider of things like perfusion and IO&M. So just the data sets we're collecting and housing and Scope for you and your sort of team to look at is bigger.
Absolutely.
So you can avoid things like confirmation biases and stuff like that.
That's right. That's right. Yep.
So let me ask this. So when you've turned that story into data and you've analyzed it like you have, and before you actually make a research paper, how do you go from the process of analyzed data to telling the story again in a research paper?
That's right.
So how do you make that conversion?
Yeah, again, in very close collaboration with our clinical experts. And so, what I'm able to say from my perspective is, here's what patterns we can see in the data. But, apart from understanding those patterns, there's still a big gulf, right, to get to what's the story, right? So it takes somebody like Linda or Andy or Al to be able to say, okay, let's put these numbers in context, right? And they'll start to say, that's a really high, that's high for, a patient to experience, or that's a low value for a patient to experience. Or this value really does not conform to most people's expectation, right? So they have the background of all the stories and the way people kind of see this practice. And then our patterns are kind of set against that and say, is this really what we thought we would find? Right. Is this really significantly different? And then you start to put the story together. And it's just really a back and forth aspect. So usually I'll supply the analysis. They'll kind of take time to interpret and digest it and kind of write about it.
Right.
And then I'll look at what they've written and I'll kind of put my spin on it and say, we kind of change it a little here, a little there. And then what we end up with is, our preliminary version of what we think this data is saying, which then is reviewed and hammered by outside entities and everything
But that's
else.
where you might start to go to conferences and things like that.
Exactly
and start to present. Yeah. So let me ask this. The person we're actually getting each story from that makes up the large pool that is housed in the Scope database may see trends. But they only see trends from the people and the cases they're actually touching. So having a Eric Tesdahl or Al Stammers or Mongero or Tony Sestokis, who has years in the field and kind of came up through perfusion or IO&M and are thought leaders in that space, and having you interpret the data and then them telling you sort of how to shape that into the story, I can see that as being incredibly beneficial because the person in the actual OR only has their experiences to guide what they should do next. And their experiences may be 100% accurate, but that is, that confirmation bias where it actually works out. If you don't have a team like what you guys have, you don't get sort of a more rounded, scope of what we're actually trying to do and the best way to prevent negative outcomes.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The numbers are really only a stand-in for the fact that one person can't witness all of these happenings, right, and keep it straight in their mind and sort it out. It's just too much for one person. So we convert it to a number, and we can do some things with those numbers. And then hopefully we're faithfully converting it back to a story, which will help. Yeah. Right? In the end, the whole point is to make surgery safer. Right. And so, if we're able to engage in this process, the numbers really don't have any value in and of themselves. They're just representing a story that we want to move forward.
Right. So once you've converted the data into a story and you're starting to go to these conferences, I'd imagine that other people in the industry, while they're at the conferences, or maybe they get wind of it through, just the networking that goes on at these things, they will have also their opinions that they will kind of cast onto the research papers. So like, how does that process work?
Yeah. And it is difficult, and it's meant to be difficult.
Sure, because it's not like a white paper that anybody can put out and say, hey, this is what this looks like.
Yeah.
It's actually peer reviewed, and that's why research papers are so valued.
That's right.
And that's why they're so difficult to write, and it's a long process. But like, how does that process work?
Yep. So typically we make the initial sort of abstract submission, and that's the first check.
Right.
Right. If it's somehow missing something fundamental in the analysis, it usually won't be selected for a competitive refereed meeting. Right. So that's one check. If you get invited to the meeting, which we most commonly do, then we go and make our presentation, which is generally representing a draft of a manuscript. Right. So we start with something small and submit it, and then it gets accepted. We go to present. We have more of a full, fleshed out analysis, and we submit a paper. At that point, then it's going to go to 3 anonymous reviewers, right? When someone's reading the paper that we've submitted, they don't know it's us, it's SpecialtyCare. I mean, they might be able to figure out if they really know the field and they see the sample size. They're like, okay, this is probably them.
That's a large sample size.
Right.
It's got to be SpecialtyCare, yeah.
It's their job to give an impartial review and say, this isn't about how I know or don't know the people involved. It's about like what constitutes a valid question and a valid analysis. And every time you get a review, you get a bunch of really difficult, critical, pressing questions.
Right.
Okay, maybe sometimes if you work with somebody who's really great, they'll come back and they'll give you a clean paper, and I'll be like, I like working with this author. As a statistician, that's always really nice. You say, okay. But often you find they always find something. Sure. Part of the job of the reviewer is to make the paper better no matter where it's at, right? So that's the part, then we get that feedback back, and sometimes it's like, oh, this was unfair, and you have to kind of go through the ego process of like, they're attacking my work, I can't believe it all.
I think that part would be difficult for me.
Yeah, it's really funny. There's a whole running joke in academia about, reviewer 2 must be stopped. It's like, there's always one reviewer who's like a zealot and really trying to go so far, and in the end, this is meant to improve everything. And so you have to just set your ego aside and say, if they found reason to criticize it, likely other reasonable people would as well. And so I need to address it. Sometimes it's a matter of changing how you've described something. They say, well, your data say this, and then you're saying a little something else. Like you need to be more in line with what your data say. Or sometimes they say, you know what, let's change that analysis around. I think you probably need to change the focus and add another variable or something. And that's where I get involved and kind of rerun the analyses. And then we resubmit it. And if the reviewers are satisfied, say, okay, you addressed my issue, you answered my question, they'll give it a big green check mark and send it back to the editor, and it'll be published.
Awesome. So is it typically published just online, or are there like medical journals they go into? I'd imagine even medical journals now have moved to online.
Yeah, most all the journals are online, and print is still, a big issue in access, whether it's online or print, is pay access, and so that's, still in the medical field really just very traditional. And so
just hiding the research behind some sort of paywall.
Yeah, that's right. So the big publishers are, good at setting up a system that facilitates the process, and so in exchange we pay some access fees and things. So
I'd imagine that people who want access to the research paper also pays those fees because they want to make their surgery safer too. So they need access to this information.
Yeah. So typically, that's through if you have a university affiliation, that university library has its subscriptions to this particular journal, and then you can go get it. That's the way most people find their way to these things. Sometimes we do make summaries of our research available. So we wrote it. It's our information, and we can't necessarily distribute that same version, right? But we can summarize it and say, here's what we found, and refer to the published version, disseminate the information.
Sure. Or you can go to conferences and give talks on it, right?
Exactly right. Yeah. It's not a secret.
Right. Well, we're not trying to keep it a secret.
Right.
You want to let as many people know so they can make their surgery safer, because ultimately, patient care is the focus.
Exactly right. Yeah.
So we're always trying to improve that.
Yeah.
One thing that struck me when we were talking before was you're not necessarily trying to answer the what question, but the why question. So that sort of struck me, and I sort of wondered if I can get you to sort of explain that. So how you find what the why question is and how you define what it is.
Yeah. I mean, the general answer is that, it all depends on the state of the research in your field. So a good contrast is actually the IONM and the perfusion, right? So perfusion has a longer history.
Yes, it does.
Because cardiac surgery has a longer history, right? Neuromonitoring as a discipline is much younger. So what it takes to say something novel and useful in the field is very different, right? Because like I said, in perfusion, you have a lot of people who have come before you.
Yeah, it's got like 50 extra years on IO&M.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of other ideas about what is important and what you need to account for in getting to a why question, right? The what questions are pretty straightforward. You know, my fitness tracker can tell me what I did last week without much trouble. It can't tell me why.
Yeah.
You know, I would need a lot of information from a lot of people.
A lot of data set.
A lot of data.
Right.
Right. So that's what we have in when we go to answer a question in perfusion, we have to take a lot more of that approach. In IO&M, it's a younger field, and so while we are able to say some really sophisticated things, account for the kind of surgery you're talking about, the region where it's happening, where they're still kind of developing their knowledge base a little bit more.
Yeah.
So a different set of requirements.
I'd imagine it's a little easier in the IO&M field just because a lot of the questions have already been answered for perfusion. And IO&M, as being younger, they have less time to have answered those questions.
As a person trained with a research background, I can tell you there's never a shortage of questions.
Sure.
There will never be a shortage of questions, because in any of these medical procedures, you have risks that need to be attended to and minimized, right? So take perfusion, for example, is a really good example that, a lot of patients get blood transfusions, and those lead to downstream consequences. There's certainly a lot of downstream consequences that, as a perfusion service provider, we want to learn as much as we can about how we impact those. Right. Kidney injury, how long you stay in the hospital, the possibility of infection. And, until those don't exist anymore, until, surgery has no bad outcomes, we'll always have questions to work on, right?
Fair enough.
It's about taking care of, people.
I mean, ultimately, you want to reduce any sort of bad outcome, and that's going to take a very, very long time.
That's right.
I'd imagine that some results can change outcomes, downstream, and they're not always changed for the better. So you may have to change, the way we look at something because of something we've changed.
Absolutely.
So there's all kind of unintended consequences that could come.
That's right. Yeah. Some of the more fun analyses that we've done on the perfusion side are able to account for competing options for taking care of the patient. It's like, I want to do option A, or I want to do option B, or sometimes people do A and B. Yeah. You kind of look at the combination of these things, and it turns out, some unpredictable results will happen. You can see from our data when people are pursuing each of these, like, well, you may want to choose this particular strategy when you're using these two tools together, because improving, one thing may lead to, like you say, a decrease or a worse outcome on something else. Yeah. So.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's all the time we have for today. I feel like I could talk about this for a very long time just because it interests me, but I really appreciate you coming in. It was very informative, and thank you so much for stopping by.
Absolutely.